What if the man you've hated for years, the one who ruined your life, was closer than you ever imagined? A struggling homeless man thought he had lost everything, until a ruthless diner owner publicly humiliated him. But what seemed like just another cruel encounter would soon unravel a shocking truth, one that would change both of their lives forever. Because karma doesn't forget, and this time, it's coming back hard. The night air was sharp, cutting through layers of worn-out fabric like tiny blades. San Francisco, despite its reputation for mild winters, had a cruel way of making the cold feel personal, especially in the Tenderloin district. Here, among the crumbling sidewalks and flickering neon lights of rundown liquor stores, the city's forgotten clung to whatever warmth they could find. Daniel Harper pulled his thin coat tighter around himself, though it did little to keep the chill at bay. He sat on the cold pavement, his back pressed against the brick wall of an abandoned storefront. A small, empty coffee cup rested by his side, an unspoken plea for spare change. The cup had been there for hours, but the few coins it had collected earlier were long gone, spent on a cheap cup of soup that had barely warmed his bones. Just a year ago, Daniel had a job, a home, and a future. He was a respected high school math teacher, someone who found joy in guiding students through complex equations, watching their eyes light up with understanding. But all of that had been ripped away. A single accusation, false, but damning, had cost him everything. He still remembered the principal's voice, heavy with forced disappointment. "I'm sorry, Daniel, but we can't ignore this. Until there's an investigation, we have to let you go." The investigation had never come. The system had moved on without him. Losing his job had started the downward spiral. Savings ran out, bills piled up. The eviction notice came like a death sentence. He had tried to fight back, to prove his innocence, but no one had cared. Once society decided you didn't belong, it shut the door in your face and never looked back. Now, he sat in the shadows of a city that had once been his home but now treated him like a ghost. The irony wasn't lost on him. He used to teach probability and statistics. Yet he had never calculated the odds of ending up like this. His fingers brushed against the $1 bill in his pocket. His last dollar. He had been holding onto it for days, reluctant to spend it, in a city where even cheap food cost more than $1. It was practically useless, but it was more than just money. It was a symbol of the thin thread he was hanging onto. A reminder that he still had something. Daniel sighed, rubbing his tired eyes, his stomach twisted with hunger. But he had learned to push it aside. He had to be careful. This dollar might be his last until he didn't know when. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed her. A small girl stood in front of the bakery across the street, her tiny frame wrapped in a tattered hoodie that was too thin for the weather. She pressed her hands against the glass display, staring at the fresh loaves of bread and pastries inside. Her face was pale, her lips dry and chapped. She was hungry. Daniel knew that look. He had worn it himself too many times to count. She didn't go inside. She just stood there, staring, as if willing the food to come to her. A man in a business suit walked past, sparing her a single glance before hurrying away. A woman pushing a stroller crossed to the other side of the street, as if afraid to be too close. No one stopped. No one asked if she was okay. Daniel's fingers tightened around the dollar bill in his pocket. He shouldn't get involved. He had his own problems, his own survival to worry about. But the way the girl looked at that bread, it reminded him of his students. Of the kids who used to come to his class hungry because their parents couldn't afford breakfast. Of the ones who stayed late not because they loved math, but because it meant avoiding home for just a little longer. He swallowed hard. It was just $1. But maybe, for her, it could be something more. He took a deep breath and pushed himself up from the pavement. Daniel hesitated at the curb, watching the little girl press her small hands against the bakery's glass. Inside, golden loaves of bread sat neatly on display, their crusts glistening under warm light. Fresh pastries lined the shelves, some dusted with powdered sugar, others stuffed with jam or cream. The air outside carried just a whisper of that comforting, buttery aroma, a cruel tease to those who could only stand and stare. He could turn away. He should. That dollar in his pocket was the only thing standing between him and absolute nothing. It wasn't much, But it was something. He'd held onto it for days. A kind of safety net, even if it was barely wide enough to catch him. Yet, as he looked at the girl, saw the way her stomach seemed to hollow beneath the oversized hoodie she wore, he knew he'd already made his decision. His feet moved before his mind could protest. Inside the bakery, warmth wrapped around him like a forgotten memory. The smell of fresh bread was almost too much, igniting a hunger so deep it hurt. His stomach clenched, his body begging him to reconsider. But he didn't. He stepped to the counter and placed his last dollar on it. "Just a plain roll," he said. The cashier, a teenage boy with earbuds in, barely looked up as he grabbed a roll from the basket and exchanged it for the bill. Daniel took it, its warmth seeping into his cold fingers, then turned and walked straight back outside. The girl flinched when he approached, her wary eyes darting to his before quickly looking away. "Here," he said, holding out the bread. She hesitated, then took it, cradling it in her hands as if it were something delicate. She looked up at him, her brown eyes wide and filled with something he hadn't seen directed at him in a long time, gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. And just like that, Daniel felt something stir inside him. A flicker of warmth in a world that had long since gone cold. For the first time in months, he felt like a person again. He turned to leave, but before he could take a step, a voice rang out behind him. "Well, isn't that something?" Daniel froze. He knew that voice, had heard it too many times before. Laced with the same sneering condescension. Steve Reynolds. Daniel turned slowly. Steve stood just outside a small diner a few doors down, arms crossed over his broad chest. The man was built like a retired linebacker, his gut stretching against the front of his grease-stained apron. His smirk was pure venom. "Didn't take you for the charitable type, Harper," Steve said, taking a step closer. "Didn't figure you had much left to give." Daniel clenched his jaw, already knowing where this was going. Steve ran the diner like his own little kingdom and treated the homeless who wandered too close like vermin. "That your last dollar?" Steve asked, tilting his head. "Must be, right? Otherwise, you'd be eating instead of playing hero." Daniel didn't respond. He wouldn't give the man the satisfaction. Steve snorted. "You got rocks in that head of yours, Harper. You're just as hungry as she is. Maybe worse. And yet you throw away your last dollar on some kid?" He scoffed, shaking his head. "Pathetic." Daniel's fingers curled into fists at his sides, nails biting into his palms. He forced himself to stay still, to swallow the anger threatening to rise. Steve leaned in slightly, his smirk deepening. "Tell me, when's the last time anyone gave a damn about you?" The words hit harder than they should have. Daniel turned without another word and walked away. He didn't look back. The little girl, still clutching the bread, watched him go. Around them, people passed by without a glance. No one had stepped in. No one had spoken up. As if none of it had happened at all. Daniel should have been used to it by now. But somehow, it still burned. A moment later, a small voice called after him. "Sir?" Daniel stopped. The girl hesitated before saying, "I'll share it with my mom." The words sent a strange ache through his chest. He turned slightly, looking back at her. She wasn't just hungry. She wasn't just alone. She had someone who depended on her. Daniel felt something shift inside him. Something he couldn't quite name. Without another word, he nodded and kept walking. Daniel pulled his coat tighter around himself as he made his way back toward the Greyhound bus station. The night air had turned sharper, the cold settling deep into his bones. The city lights flickered in the distance, a world away from the forgotten corners where people like him tried to survive. He hadn't planned on walking this far, but after Steve's words, he needed to get away from the diner, from that sneering face, from the feeling of being stripped down to nothing. He hadn't regretted giving the girl his last dollar, at least. That's what he told himself. But now, as the hunger gnawed at his stomach, a bitter thought crept in. What difference had it made? He still had nothing. His thoughts were interrupted when he saw a familiar small figure sitting on the edge of the sidewalk near the station. Emma. She was huddled next to a woman, pressing close for warmth. The woman, her mother, Daniel assumed, looked exhausted. Her face was gaunt, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail, dark circles beneath her eyes. And in Emma's hands was the bread roll. now torn in half. Daniel stopped a few feet away, watching as Emma carefully handed one half to her mother. Lisa took it hesitantly, then smiled weakly before breaking off a small piece and giving it back to Emma. The girl frowned. "Mom, you need to eat." Lisa sighed but took a bite, chewing slowly, as if trying to make it last. Daniel felt something in his chest tighten. His last dollar had bought that roll. His last dollar had ended up in the hands of someone who needed it more than he did. For the first time in a long time, he felt ashamed, not for what he'd done, but for the fact that he'd even questioned it. Emma glanced up then, spotting him. Her face brightened immediately, and she nudged her mother. Lisa followed her gaze and stiffened slightly, clearly wary. Daniel hesitated before stepping forward. He wasn't sure what he was going to say. Emma spoke first. "You're the nice man from before." Daniel let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "I don't know about that." Lisa's eyes scanned him cautiously, taking in his worn-out clothes, his tired face. She wasn't judging, she was trying to figure out if he was a threat. "I saw what you did," she said finally. Her voice was soft, but there was an edge of resilience beneath it. "Thank you." Daniel shrugged. "It was just a piece of bread." Lisa shook her head. "Not to her." Emma grinned, holding up the roll as if proving her mother's point. "It was really good." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to being thanked. Lisa studied him for a moment, then gestured to the empty space on the sidewalk beside them. "You can sit, if you want." He hesitated. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he lowered himself onto the cold pavement. For a while, none of them spoke. The city moved around them, cars passing, people coming and going from the station, the occasional distant siren. But in this small pocket of the world, it was quiet. Finally, Lisa broke the silence. "I used to be a waitress," she said, her gaze focused somewhere in the distance. "Nothing fancy. A diner in Soma. Then I messed up my back and couldn't work. Lost the job, lost the apartment, been at the shelter for a while. But," she trailed off. Daniel understood the rest without her having to say it. Shelters were temporary solutions. They were overcrowded, underfunded, and filled with people just as desperate as she was. "It's not forever," Lisa added, almost like she was trying to convince herself. Emma leaned against her, nodding sleepily. Daniel felt a sharp pang in his chest. Lisa was right, this wouldn't last forever. But that wasn't always a good thing. Some people clawed their way back. Others just disappeared. He wasn't sure which category he fit into yet. Lisa turned to him. "What about you?" Daniel hesitated. The real answer was complicated, messy, full of anger and regret and things he didn't want to say out loud. So he just shrugged. "Same as you. Life fell apart." Lisa didn't push. Maybe she understood that some stories were too raw to be told in one sitting. Emma yawned, rubbing her eyes. Lisa wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. Daniel watched them, something heavy settling in his chest. He had nothing, but at least he only had to worry about himself. Lisa had Emma, and yet, even with so little, they had shared what they had. The thought stuck with him. Before he could think too much about it, movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. A man sat on a bench a few feet away, watching him. Daniel tensed slightly. The man was older, well dressed in a dark overcoat and polished shoes. Out of place in this part of the city. When their eyes met, the man smiled, just a small, knowing smile. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. Daniel frowned, watching him disappear into the night. Something about him felt off, not threatening, just strange. He let out a slow breath, pushing the thought aside. For now, he had enough to think about. Daniel lay awake on the cold pavement outside the Greyhound station, his stomach twisting in painful knots. The hunger was worse at night when there was nothing to distract him. Nothing to dull the ache that gnawed at his insides. He pulled his coat tighter around himself. But the fabric was thin, offering little against the chill that seeped into his bones. He had given away his last dollar. At the time, it had felt right. The girl had needed it more than he did. But now, as the city slept and his body screamed for food, doubt crept in. Steve's voice echoed in his mind. "You're just as hungry as she is. Maybe worse. And yet you throw away your last dollar on some kid? Pathetic." Daniel clenched his jaw, trying to push the thought away. It wasn't regret, not really, but it was something close. His stomach let out a loud growl, and he groaned, pressing a hand against it. Maybe if he could sleep, he could forget the hunger, at least for a while. But sleep didn't come easy on an empty stomach. He sat up and glanced around the small cluster of people who had claimed their own spots along the sidewalk near the station. A few were curled under tattered blankets, others tucked into the shadows, their faces hidden. It wasn't safe to sleep too deeply out here. Reaching for his bag, what little he had left in the world, his fingers met nothing but pavement. His breath caught. The bag was gone. Heart pounding, he scrambled to his feet, scanning the area. A few feet away, two men huddled near the curb, rummaging through something that had once belonged to him. "Hey," Daniel's voice came out hoarse, but sharp enough to make them look up. One of them, a wiry guy with a scar down his cheek, smirked. "You should have kept it closer." "Man." Daniel stepped forward, fists clenching. "That's mine." The other man, stockier with a thick beard, scoffed. "Not anymore." Daniel's eyes darted to the contents spilling from the torn fabric, an extra shirt, a pair of socks, a small notepad he used to write in when he could find a pen. Nothing of real value, but it was all he had. Wiry Scar laughed, shaking his head. "Relax, Professor. We just figured if you had enough to be throwing money away on some kid, you had more to spare." Daniel stiffened. They had seen him earlier. He swallowed the frustration bubbling in his throat. There was no use fighting. If he started something, he wouldn't win. He was too weak, too hungry, and he knew how things worked out here. Without another word, he turned and walked away. The laughter behind him burned more than the cold. He had done the right thing. So why did it feel like he was being punished for it? He kept walking, not sure where he was going. He just needed to move, to get away from the feeling of loss clinging to his skin. The streets were quieter now, the distant hum of the city a reminder that life kept moving even when he felt stuck. Then, like a bad joke, fate delivered one last blow. Steve. The diner was closed for the night, but Steve stood outside, leaning against the wall, lighting a cigarette. His gaze landed on Daniel, and a slow smirk curled on his face. Well, Steve exhaled smoke through his nose. "Look what the cat dragged in." Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have the energy. Steve pushed off the wall, stepping closer. "Rough night, Harper?" Daniel kept his expression blank, refusing to give him the satisfaction. Steve chuckled, flicking ash onto the sidewalk. "You really are something. Thought you were better than the rest of us. Huh? Gave away your last dollar just to end up right back here. Starving and empty-handed." Daniel turned to walk away. The sound of coins clinking against the pavement stopped him. Steve had tossed a handful of change at his feet. "If you're smart, you'll pick those up," Steve said, voice dripping with mockery. "Learn to beg properly. It's the only way you're gonna survive." Daniel's hands curled into fists. He wanted to say something, to fight back, to claw at whatever dignity he had left. But dignity didn't fill an empty stomach. Without a word, he stepped over the coins and kept walking. Steve laughed behind him. "Suit yourself, Professor." Daniel didn't stop, didn't look back, but he felt every ounce of that humiliation settle deep into his bones. He kept walking until the laughter faded, until the city swallowed the sound whole. And in the shadows, a pair of eyes followed his every move. The man from before, sitting on the same bench near the station, hands folded in his lap, watching. He said nothing, did nothing, just observed. Daniel didn't notice him. Not yet. Daniel sat hunched against the rough brick wall of an alleyway, his head resting on his knees. The hunger had settled into something deeper now, not just an ache, but a hollowness that made his limbs feel leaden, his thoughts sluggish. He had lost track of time, but he knew it had been 2 days since his last meal. His body trembled, drained of energy, and his mind drifted in and out of clarity. Every sound, the distant honk of a car, the rustle of a plastic bag caught in the wind, felt distant, as if he were slipping away from the world one moment at a time. He hadn't meant to come here, to this dead-end alley near the bus station. His feet had carried him aimlessly after Steve's cruel words. After losing what little he had left, there was nowhere to go, nothing to do except wait. For what? The thought terrified him. For the hunger to stop? For the cold to claim him? Was this it? His breathing was slow, unsteady. He pressed his palm against his ribs, feeling how sharply they jutted beneath his skin. He had seen others disappear like this. One day they were there. The next, gone. No one questioned it. No one cared. A flicker of anger sparked inside him. Not at the world. Not at Steve. Not even at the people who passed by him every day without a second glance. He was angry at himself. For being weak. For letting himself slip so far that he had no way back. His vision blurred. His head tilted forward. Maybe if he just closed his eyes for a little while. Hey. A small voice. He barely registered it at first. Hey, mister. A hand touched his shoulder, shaking him lightly. He blinked, forcing his head up. She stood in front of him, bundled in the same oversized hoodie, her small hands holding something wrapped in a napkin. I found you, she said, relieved. You left before I could say thank you. Daniel blinked at her, his mind slow to catch up. Emma knelt beside him, her face scrunched in concern. You look really bad, she said bluntly. Then, as if remembering why she was there, she unwrapped the napkin, revealing a small piece of bread. She held it out to him. Here, I got this from the church people. They give out food sometimes. It's not much, but Daniel just stared. His mind was too foggy to process it fully. He had given her food, and now she was giving it back. Not because she had to. Because she wanted to. His fingers trembled as he reached out, taking the piece of bread. It was small, barely a few bites, but in that moment, it felt like more than he deserved. He forced himself to sit up straighter, his body protesting with every movement. You should keep it, he muttered. Emma shook her head. You gave me yours first. It's fair. He let out a weak breath, something close to a laugh. Fair. Life hadn't been fair to either of them. Yet here she was, trying to make it so. He took a slow bite, the dry bread sticking to his throat. But it was the best thing he had tasted in days. Emma smiled, satisfied. See? Better, right? Daniel didn't answer. He just nodded. She sat down next to him, kicking her feet against the pavement. Mom says we might have a real place soon. The shelter lady said they're working on it. That's good, Daniel managed. Emma glanced at him, her expression suddenly serious. You should come too. He tensed. I mean, she hurried. They help people, like you. Maybe they can. I don't need help. The words came out harsher than he intended. Emma flinched slightly but didn't back down. Everybody needs help sometimes. Daniel looked away. He had spent so long clawing to survive on his own that the idea of relying on anyone else felt impossible. Before he could say anything else, movement caught his eye. A man stepped toward them. Daniel tensed on instinct, but Emma didn't react, as if she hadn't even noticed him. The man was older, dressed in a well-tailored coat that didn't belong in a place like this. His posture was relaxed, hands in his pockets, but his gaze was sharp, assessing. He stopped a few feet away and pulled something from his coat. A crisp $50 bill. He held it out. If you want it, the man said. Take it, but first, tell me, if you could go back, would you still give her the dollar? Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. The money was real. He could take it and buy food, a warm drink, something to chase away the cold for at least a little while. But the question was something else. Daniel stared at the crisp $50 bill in the stranger's hand. The weight of the question lingered in the cold night air. If you could go back, the man repeated, his voice calm but steady. Would you still give her the dollar? Daniel's throat was dry. He forced himself to sit up, though every muscle protested. The hunger, the exhaustion, the cold, they all pressed against him like a crushing force. He could barely think past the dull ache in his skull. Yet something about the man's presence demanded an answer. Would he do it again? He wanted to say yes, but the truth was harder to hold onto when his stomach was empty. When his body felt like it was shutting down, the logical part of him whispered that a single dollar wouldn't have changed Emma's life. But it sure as hell could have bought him one more day of warmth, of clarity, of time to figure something out. But then he thought of her standing outside that bakery, the way she had looked at that bread, the way she had come back to share with her mother, and later, with him. She had been starving, just like him, and yet, the moment she had something, she had given it away. Daniel let out a slow breath. He shook his head. I wouldn't change it, he said, his voice hoarse but firm. I'd do it again. For a long moment, the man, Daniel still didn't know his name, just looked at him. Then, to his shock, he smiled. It wasn't the polite, dismissive kind of smile Daniel was used to from people who pitied him. This one held something else. Approval, maybe, amusement. Then, just as quickly, the man folded the $50 bill and slipped it back into his coat pocket. Daniel blinked. Wait. The man raised a hand. Cutting him off. You made your choice. He turned, stepping away into the dim streetlight. Good luck, Mr. Harper. Daniel's stomach twisted, not just from hunger, but confusion. He hadn't told the man his name. Before he could say anything else, the man walked away, disappearing into the night as if he had never been there. Daniel sat there, stunned, his mind too sluggish to make sense of what had just happened. Then, a new voice broke through the haze. Well, looks like someone's got a secret. Daniel's head snapped up. The diner owner stood a few feet away, arms crossed over his broad chest, watching him with the same smug grin that had haunted Daniel since the day he lost everything. But this time, there was something else in his eyes. Suspicion. I saw you talking to that guy. Steve continued, taking a slow step forward. Didn't know you had rich friends. Daniel forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady beneath him. I don't. Steve's grin widened. Funny. Looked like he was about to hand you something. And then you let him walk away. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't owe Steve anything. But Steve wasn't talking just to him. Daniel noticed, too late, that a few of the other homeless men from around the station had started to take interest. They lingered in the shadows, watching, listening. Steve turned toward them. You know, boys, I always thought Harper here was just another bum. But maybe he's been holding out on us. The murmur started low but grew. Daniel tensed. He knew how fast things could turn bad out here. I don't have anything, he said, trying to keep his voice level. Steve scoffed. Right, just out here making friends with rich guys for fun. Huh? He turned to the others. Bet he's got a stash somewhere. Probably been playing all of us. One of the men, a wiry guy Daniel recognized from the bus station, took a step closer. That true, Harper? You got something you ain't sharing? Daniel shook his head. No, but he could see it in their eyes. Doubt. It didn't take much to turn desperation into anger. And Steve knew it. The grin on his face told Daniel exactly what he wanted, to watch him get torn apart. Daniel took a step back. They took a step forward. His heart pounded. He needed to get out of here. Now. The tension in the air thickened as the group of men stepped closer. Their faces set with suspicion. The hunger and desperation in their eyes made them unpredictable. And Daniel knew that once doubt took root in a place like this, it spread like wildfire. You been holding out on us, Harper? The wiry man from before sneered, cracking his knuckles. His voice was low, but there was an edge to it, something dangerous. Daniel shook his head, keeping his hands open, non-threatening. I don't have anything, he said. That guy wasn't giving me money. He was just, liar. The word came from somewhere in the group. And then the murmur started again. Steve stood at the edge of it all, arms crossed, watching like a man enjoying the show. You know what I think? Steve said, his voice dripping with amusement. I think our buddy here has been playing all of us, pretending he's one of us, while some rich friend slips him cash on the side. That's not true, Daniel said, his pulse hammering in his ears. Then empty your pockets, someone challenged. Daniel took an instinctive step back. That was all the proof they needed. Before he could react, a pair of hands shoved him hard. He hit the pavement, his shoulder slamming against the cold concrete. A sharp pain shot through his ribs as rough hands grabbed at his coat. Fingers yanking at his pockets, searching for money that wasn't there. Check his shoes, someone growled. People hide cash in their shoes. Daniel struggled, twisting beneath them, but hunger had left him weak. His arms felt like lead. The hands on him were too many, too strong. His head slammed against the ground. And for a second, everything blurred. Steve's laughter rang through the night air. And then, Stop. A small voice, high and desperate. The pressure on Daniel's body eased just enough for him to turn his head. Emma stood there, fists clenched, her face pale with anger. "Leave him alone," she shouted. "He doesn't have anything." Silence. The men hesitated, their grip on Daniel loosening. Steve let out a slow whistle. "Well, ain't this something?" He cocked his head, smirking. "You got yourself a little guardian angel." Harper. Emma stepped forward, standing between Daniel and the others, her tiny frame trembling. "He's not lying," she said. "He's just like us." Something about the way she said it, like it was the most obvious thing in the world, cut through the haze of anger and desperation in the group. The moment stretched. Then, one by one, they stepped back. No one spoke. Steve's expression darkened. He had wanted a show. Instead, he got something else. With a huff, he shoved his hands into his pockets. "Bunch of fools," he muttered before turning and stalking off into the night. Daniel lay there, breathless, as the crowd slowly dissolved. Emma knelt beside him, her small hands gripping his sleeve. "Are you okay?" Daniel pushed himself up with a wince. He looked at her, really looked at her. And then, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he made a choice, not just to survive, but to change. Daniel walked. His legs ached, his ribs still bruised from the night before. But he kept moving. He had no destination, only the need to put distance between himself and the bus station, the alleyways, and the people who had just turned on him. Tenderloin District was all he had known for months. But he couldn't stay, not after what had happened, not after coming so close to losing himself completely. So he walked, past the rows of makeshift tents, past the people curled up under dirty blankets, the ones still awake watching him with cautious eyes, past the places where no one had anything, and no one expected more. He kept walking until the world around him changed. The buildings grew taller, cleaner. Neon liquor store signs gave way to polished storefronts with warm lighting and tasteful decor. The air smelled different here: coffee, baked goods, expensive cologne instead of sweat and desperation. He had wandered into another world, one where people passed him without a glance, their hands gripping designer bags, their heads buried in their phones. Here, a man like him was invisible. He pulled his coat tighter around himself, acutely aware of how out of place he was. He could feel the glances from those who did notice him, quick, dismissive. A few people even crossed the street. He wasn't supposed to be here. Then, ahead, a familiar figure stood outside a cafe. James. The older man was leaning against a lamppost, dressed sharply in a dark wool coat. A paper coffee cup rested in his hand, steam curling into the chilly air. He wasn't looking at Daniel, but there was no doubt that he had been waiting. Daniel hesitated. Part of him wanted to turn around, but another part, the part that had been gnawing at him since their last conversation, kept him rooted in place. James glanced up then, as if sensing his presence, and smiled. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't show." Daniel frowned. "I didn't know I had an appointment." James pushed off the lamppost and gestured to the cafe behind him. "Let's get inside. You look like hell." Daniel didn't move. James studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Fine. We'll talk here." He took a sip of his coffee. "You want to start over?" Daniel crossed his arms. "Start over how?" James nodded toward a bench nearby. "Sit down." Daniel hesitated again, then finally moved, lowering himself onto the bench. James sat beside him, placing his coffee down carefully. Then, without preamble, he said, "I know who you are." "Daniel." Something in Daniel's stomach tightened. James reached into his coat and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. He handed it to Daniel. The paper was old, the edges yellowed, but the headline was still clear. "High school teacher under investigation for missing funds." Daniel's breath hitched. He scanned the article, even though he already knew what it said. The accusations, the school's statement about suspending him, the speculation that he had stolen from the student fund. His name, right there in bold print. His hands clenched around the paper. "Where did you get this?" James didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "I make it a habit to look into the people I help," he said. "And your story, well, it's not the usual one." Daniel felt sick. Why are you showing me this? James exhaled slowly. Because I know who set you up. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. James pulled out another folded paper. This one was a printout, a newer article. Not from a newspaper but from an online blog. Daniel took it with numb fingers and read. It was about Steve. Not about the diner. Not about the man who tormented him on the streets. It was about the Steve from before. Local school accountant resigns amid internal audit. Daniel scanned the article, his vision narrowing. Steve Reynolds had worked for the district's financial office before leaving under undisclosed circumstances. Then he saw the date. It had been 3 months after Daniel had been fired. His chest tightened. The pieces fell into place so fast it made his head spin. Steve had worked in the school system, had access to the financial records, had left suddenly, but not before someone else had taken the fall for missing funds. Daniel had never stolen anything. Steve had, and he had let Daniel take the blame. The blood drained from Daniel's face. His grip on the paper tightened. James watched him carefully. I know this is a lot to process. Daniel swallowed, trying to breathe past the rage building inside him. All this time, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. All these months, he had thought it was just bad luck. That the world had chosen him at random to knock down. To push so low that he barely existed anymore. But it hadn't been random. Steve had done this to him. The same man who had kicked him while he was down. Who had humiliated him on the street. Daniel felt like he couldn't breathe. James let the silence stretch, giving him space. Then, after a moment, he spoke again. You have a choice, he said. You can walk away, keep living the way you have been, and let him keep getting away with it. Daniel's jaw clenched. Or, James continued, his voice quieter now, you can do something about it. Daniel looked up, meeting James's steady gaze. There was no pity in it, no empty sympathy, just an offer. A door left slightly open, waiting to be walked through. Daniel didn't respond right away. His mind was still racing, his pulse still hammering in his ears. But deep in his gut, something shifted. The helplessness, the exhaustion, the endless cycle of just trying to survive. It wasn't enough anymore. He wanted more. For the first time in months, he wanted justice. Daniel stared at the folder in front of him. The weight of it wasn't just in the pages it contained, but in what it meant. Proof. Evidence that his life had been destroyed by one man's greed. James sat across from him, his expression unreadable. You have a choice, he said, his voice calm but firm. You can take this, clear your name, and walk away from all of this. Or, he paused, letting the unspoken alternative settle in the air. Daniel exhaled slowly. He had spent months convinced that fate had singled him out for punishment. That he had been a casualty of bad luck. But this wasn't chance. This wasn't the universe turning against him. It had been Steve. He had suffered on the streets while the man who framed him thrived. Daniel clenched his jaw. I want justice, he said, voice steady. James studied him for a moment, then nodded. Then let's get to work. Daniel spent the next 2 days going through everything James had gathered. Bank statements, internal emails, a resignation letter that hinted at ethical discrepancies but never outright admitted guilt. James had connections, lawyers, journalists, people who could use this. But that wasn't enough. Steve had been getting away with this for too long. If Daniel was going to take him down, he needed to look him in the eye when he did it. So he waited, and when the time came, he walked straight back into the fire. The diner looked the same. Greasy windows, flickering neon sign, the same faint stench of burnt coffee and fried food. Inside, Steve was barking orders at one of the cooks, his usual smug confidence on full display. But the moment he saw Daniel, something shifted. Steve smirked, leaning against the counter. Well, look who finally crawled back. What's the matter, Harper? Cold out there? Daniel didn't react. He pulled the folder from his coat and placed it on the counter between them. I'm not here for a handout, he said quietly. I'm here to settle things. Steve glanced at the folder, then back at Daniel. The hell is this? Daniel's voice was cold. Your past catching up to you. Steve's smirk faltered, just for a second. Then he scoffed, flipping open the folder with exaggerated boredom. His eyes scanned the first few pages. his expression shifting as the reality of what he was looking at sank in. Daniel saw it, the flicker of recognition, the tightening of his jaw. Then, just as quickly, Steve forced out a laugh and shut the folder. "This is garbage," he said. Daniel didn't move. "That garbage is enough to bury you." Steve leaned in, voice low. "And who's gonna believe it? You?" He chuckled darkly. "You think anyone's gonna listen to a washed-up bum?" Daniel didn't blink. "Maybe not, but they'll listen to James." Steve's face twitched. He glanced over Daniel's shoulder, as if just now realizing he might not be alone in this. Daniel took a step closer, his voice quieter now. "This isn't just about me. You didn't just ruin my life, you stole from kids. From their futures." Steve forced a smirk, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Even if this was real, what do you want? Money? A job? You looking to cut a deal?" Daniel almost laughed. He had spent so long barely surviving that the idea of negotiating, of accepting some hush money just to get by, might have tempted him once. "Not anymore. I don't want anything from you," he said. "I just want you to pay for what you did." Steve's smirk finally vanished. Daniel turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he heard the man's voice. Quieter this time. "You think this is over?" Daniel looked back. Steve's expression was tight, his fingers gripping the folder a little too hard. Daniel met his gaze. "Steady." "No," he said, "but for you, it's about to be." And with that, he walked out. Steve laughed, a short, sharp sound, more forced than genuine. He leaned back against the counter of the diner, crossing his arms. "This is cute," he said, smirking. "You walk in here like you've got something. Like anyone gives a damn about what you think you know." Daniel didn't react. He had expected this. The denial, the arrogance. Steve had been getting away with things for too long to think he could ever be caught. Steve picked up the folder, flipping through the pages with a theatrical sigh. "So what? You dug up some old records? Maybe even found a couple of people willing to talk?" He tossed the papers onto the counter. "It's nothing. No one is gonna listen to a guy like you." Daniel met his eyes. "They already are." Something in Steve's expression shifted. Just a flicker, but Daniel caught it. "You're bluffing," Steve muttered, but there was no confidence in his voice anymore. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. He placed it on the counter and turned the screen toward Steve. The email was open. Sent. Attached were scanned copies of every document. The message had gone out to James's lawyers, an investigative journalist, and a few other names Steve didn't recognize but clearly understood. His face paled. Daniel spoke evenly. "It's over. You can either come clean now or watch this blow up in ways you can't control." Steve swallowed. His fingers curled around the edge of the counter, knuckles whitening. Then, as if snapping back into himself, he scoffed. "You really think this is just about me?" Daniel didn't answer. Steve leaned forward, voice lower now. "I have friends. People in places you don't even know exist. If I go down, I won't be the only one. And I promise you, Harper, some of them, they won't let this go." Daniel held his ground, then let them come. For the first time since walking into this place, it was Steve who looked nervous. Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Steve exhaled, shaking his head. "You're making a mistake." "No," Daniel said, "I'm fixing one." Behind him, the diner door opened. James stepped inside, followed by a man in a suit, one of the lawyers. The room seemed smaller now, heavier. Steve glanced between them, then back at Daniel. He knew. It was over. His shoulders slumped just slightly. His fingers tapped against the counter, like a man calculating his options. Then, finally, he muttered, "What do you want?" Daniel's voice was steady. "Justice." Steve let out a breath, looking away. "You're gonna regret this," he said under his breath. Daniel didn't flinch. "No," he said, "I won't." James nodded to the lawyer, who stepped forward, placing more documents in front of Steve. "I suggest you cooperate," the man said. Steve hesitated. Then, finally, he reached for a pen. And just like that, the empire he had built on stolen money and lies began to crumble. The case moved quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. Steve was forced to resign from his position at the diner, not that it mattered anymore. His former ties to the school district, his sudden departure all those years ago, The missing funds, it all came to light. And with it, names. People Steve had worked with. People who had helped cover for him. Investigations widened. More resignations followed. By the time it was done, the damage stretched far beyond Steve himself. But Daniel? For the first time in a long time, he wasn't the one losing. James met him outside the courthouse on the day Steve formally accepted the charges against him. The older man studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You could have handled this differently," he said. Daniel knew what he meant. He could have sought revenge. He could have made it personal. But he hadn't. Daniel simply nodded. "I didn't do this for me," he said. James smiled slightly. "That's why you won." Daniel exhaled, looking up at the city around him. The fight was over. But his story wasn't. The city looked different from this side of the glass. Daniel sat in a small office, sunlight streaming through the window, warming his hands as they rested on the smooth wooden desk. It wasn't a big space, just a desk, a couple of chairs, and a bookshelf filled with old binders, but it was his. A job, a real one. A few months ago, he had been sleeping on cold concrete, counting pennies for his next meal. Now, he had a place to be, a reason to wake up in the morning. James had offered him a position at Second Chance Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping the homeless find stability. They provided shelter, job training, legal aid, things Daniel wished he had known existed when he first lost everything. Now, he was the one helping others. His first assignment had been simple: intake interviews, listening to stories from people who had been where he once was, helping them fill out paperwork, connecting them to services. He had expected it to be difficult, to feel like he was looking into a mirror of his past. And in some ways, it was. But there was something else, too. Something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Lisa stood there, Emma peeking from behind her. Daniel smiled. "Come in." Lisa stepped inside, her movements more confident than the last time he had seen her. The exhaustion was still there, but now there was hope. Too. She had gotten a job at a small bakery, and with help from the foundation, she and Emma had moved into an apartment, just a one-bedroom. But it was theirs. Emma ran up to Daniel's desk, placing a small paper bag in front of him. "Mom made an extra muffin today. For you." Daniel chuckled, pulling the bag open. The sweet smell of cinnamon filled the room. "Best delivery I've had all day," he said. Emma beamed. Lisa sat down, watching him carefully. "How are you holding up?" Daniel hesitated. The truth was, he still wasn't sure. Some days felt solid, like he was standing on steady ground again. Other days, the weight of everything, the past, the unknown future, crept in. But he was here. He was trying. "I'm doing all right," he said finally. Lisa nodded. "Good." They talked for a while. About her job, about Emma's new school, about the little things that made life feel normal again. Eventually, they left, and Daniel leaned back in his chair, looking at the city outside. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem like something to be feared. Then, the letter arrived. It was slipped under his office door sometime during the afternoon. No return address, just his name, written in small, sharp letters. Daniel frowned, unfolding the paper. The message was short. "You think it's over? There are bigger threats than Steve out there. Be careful who you trust." A slow chill crept down his spine. He read the words again, then looked up, scanning the quiet office as if expecting someone to be watching. No one was there, but suddenly, he wasn't sure if he was alone. Daniel sat in his office, the letter still resting on his desk. The words lingered in his mind, unsettling but not entirely surprising. A few months ago, something like this would have rattled him, left him spiraling in fear and uncertainty. But now, it only fueled something deeper, a need for answers. He had thought Steve was the end of the road, that taking him down meant closing a chapter of his life. But if this letter was telling the truth, then Steve had only been a small piece of something much larger. Daniel exhaled and leaned back in his chair. There was still work to be done. James stepped inside, his usual calm expression in place. He glanced at the letter but didn't comment on it. Instead, he walked over and placed a file on the desk. "You've done well," James said. "You got justice." And you got your life back. Daniel eyed the file. But, James smiled slightly. But I think you could do more. Daniel arched a brow. You've been through hell, Daniel. You know what it's like to have everything taken from you. And now, you know how to fight back. James said, that kind of experience can change lives. You want me to keep working here? I want you to do more than just work here. James said, I want you to help others the way I helped you. Daniel looked down at the file. Flipping it open. Inside were profiles, names, faces, histories, people struggling, people who had been failed by the same system that had abandoned him. You'd be good at this. James said, you understand what's at stake in a way most people don't. Daniel ran his fingers over the pages. For years, he had been drifting, surviving without purpose, even when he had been fighting to clear his name. It had felt like something personal, something just for himself. This was different. This was a chance to turn everything he had been through into something meaningful. He closed the file, looked up at James. I'm in. James nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes. But before he could say anything else, Daniel reached for the letter. There's something else, Daniel said, handing it over. James read it, his expression barely shifting. When he finished, he folded it neatly and placed it back on the desk. So, Daniel said, who else is out there? James didn't answer right away. Then, with a small, knowing smile, he said, I guess we'll find out. That evening, Daniel stepped out of the office and into the cool San Francisco air. The streets were alive, cars honking, people moving, the distant hum of a city that never truly rested. His feet carried him toward the Tenderloin district. He had spent so many nights there, lost, cold, broken, but now, as he walked past the familiar streets, past the alleys where he had once curled up for warmth, he felt something different. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't hiding. He was ready. The wind picked up, cold but not unkind. Daniel pulled his coat tighter and kept walking. Life has a way of bringing the truth to light, no matter how deeply it's buried. Daniel's journey wasn't just about reclaiming his name. It was about proving that integrity and resilience can stand against even the most powerful enemies. Steve thought he could escape justice. But in the end, karma had other plans. What would you have done in Daniel's shoes? Would you have fought back? Or walked away? Let us know in the comments below. And if you love stories of justice, redemption, and the unexpected twists of fate, don't forget to subscribe to Shadow Secrets for more gripping tales that will leave you thinking long after the story ends.